Support for today's episode of Script Apart comes from Screencraft. Breaking into Hollywood as an aspiring writer can be a confusing, convoluted path. Fortunately, Screencraft are here to help writers with both the craft of writing and the business of Hollywood. Screencraft has everything for your writing journey, from video lectures by your favorite writers such as J.J. Abrams and Tony Gilroy, to a daily blog with amazing advice. It's also no secret that Screencraft have the best screenwriting competitions around. Hundreds of past winners and finalists have started their careers with the direct support of Screencraft. Netflix, Amazon, Apple TV+, Lionsgate, Universal, Blumhouse, Hulu, the list goes on and on of places that Screencraft winners have sold scripts to or have got staffed on shows at. So if you're an aspiring writer, don't wait to check out Screencraft at screencraft.org today. Follow the link in today's show notes to find out more and get your writing dreams started. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Script Apart, a podcast about the first draft secrets of great movies and TV shows. I'm your host, Al Horner, and today on the show, we have with us one of the defining horror storytellers of the last decade. He's a trusted custodian of tales by some of the greatest horror authors of all time, with Stephen King, Shirley Jackson, and Edgar Allan Poe, just some of the names that he's adapted. He's made a string of acclaimed movies and TV shows, including The Haunting of Hill House, The Haunting of Bly Manor, and of course, the Shining sequel, Dr. Sleep. No work of his, however, is more personal or more profound than 2021's astonishing Midnight Mass. Yes, you've guessed it, it's the one and only Mike Flanagan. I don't really know where to begin telling you guys how intense a personal connection I had to this harrowing vampire story, which may be one of the most devastating but also strangely hopeful TV experiences I have ever had. On today's episode, Mike and I delve deep into the story's creation, going back in time not just to the first draft of its teleplay, not even just to the first draft of an earlier feature film version of the story. No, the conversation you're about to hear goes all the way back to the creation of Midnight Mass, the novel. That's where this tale began life, and the story of its evolution into one of the most moving meditations on religion in recent memory is in fact the story of a series of huge life changes for the filmmaker, as his relationship to alcohol, faith, family, and so many other facets of his existence began to alter. The show told the story of a man named Riley, a recovering addict returning to his small, isolated hometown of Crockett Island after spending 4 years in jail for killing someone in a drink driving incident. There he reunites with an old flame named Erin Green. Erin is played by Kate Siegel, Mike's partner and frequent collaborator. Erin is pregnant, but that pregnancy takes on an unexpected turn following the arrival of an enigmatic young priest who begins to unleash upon members of the local church-going community a series of seemingly impossible miracles. What follows from there is an unholy, blood-soaked baptism as a line between what's miraculous and what's monstrous becomes dangerously blurred. In the spoiler conversation you're about to hear, Mike tells me why his love for Midnight Mass is so great that he still has the angel/vampire's enormous wings in his garage. We get into early abandoned plans for a second season of the show in which Riley was to be revived as the show's antagonist. That's right, the plan was to have him become a traveling preacher with a Southern Baptist revival tent that toured America. We also talk about a major character switch that would have led to a very different story, and the musicality of the monologues that have become a big calling card of Mike's work, and of which there are of course a number of really beautiful examples in Midnight Mass. Next up for Mike is House of Usher, coming later this year, so get ready to hear a little bit about what's in store there. There's also some interesting tidbits about hanging out with video game icon Hideo Kojima, the Nightmare on Elm Street film that he has an idea for but is struggling to secure the rights to, and about a script he wrote centered on the same fungus as the one at the heart of The Last of Us. It was a joy to record this one. Mike has been a dream guest of mine since we started this podcast, so it was more than worth the wait. I really hope you guys enjoy it. One tiny thing to mention before we jump in: if you like what we do and would like to see the show continue to grow, you can support us on Patreon. For the price of a single monthly cup of coffee, you'll get ad-free episodes, early access to episodes, the chance to ask your questions to upcoming guests, and excitingly, as of today, a brand new bonus segment video series called Postscript, which is kind of like a little debrief between me and my producer Cam, talking about the episode that just dropped, the things we learned, the things we loved hearing about, all that kind of stuff. Head to patreon.com/scriptapart if you'd like to get involved there. We really do appreciate your support. Okay, with that all out the way, let's get into it. This is the incredible Mike Flanagan discussing the first draft secrets of Midnight Mass. Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, produced by Camille Demek. Mike Flanagan, welcome to Script Apart. How's it going today?
I'm doing so good. How are you?
I'm doing good, man. It's 10 p.m. my time, so this conversation's not quite a midnight mass, but we're getting there. We're in the right direction, yeah. It's great to have you with us, man. You're a filmmaker who, just to put all my cards on the table, I simultaneously adore, but also have a long list of moments that I'll never, ever forgive you for putting me through. So the scream from the backseat in Hill House episode 8, the kill yourself moment in Doctor Sleep, the ending of Absentia, a bunch of choice moments in Midnight Mass, which we're going to be discussing today. I could go on here.
Wow, thank you. That means an awful lot. Yeah, I very much appreciate that, and I apologize.
Don't apologize to me. Apologize to my neighbors who've had to hear me shrieking through the walls. In all seriousness, though, Mike, in addition to the terror of your work, there's also like an incredible emotionality, and it's one of the things that I really connect to about your films and your shows. Terror and catharsis are often two sides of the same coin in your stories, with ghosts and monsters prodding your characters in the direction of breakthroughs that they need to have or emotions they need to confront. The story of a Mike Flanagan series or movie is often the story of a character or characters being forced into personal reckonings that they've hid from. Is that a fair characterization, would you say? And if so, where does that incredible tenderness in your work come from, do you think?
I love what you said, so I hope it's a fair characterization of it. I think I got that because I grew up reading Stephen King, and I think he does that so beautifully. When it changed for me when I became a parent as well. What resonated with me about horror changed because the scares and the genre moments and all the stuff that the horror fans come for, all of that stuff gets to be repetitive. It gets to be predictable. It's kind of the candy we toss out there to get people to come listen to our story, right? And for me, without that humanistic gear, without some kind of vein of love and empathy and hope, the horror doesn't land. Bleakness on a bleak landscape is just depression. There's no real contrast or stakes if everything is just evil. And Stephen King, very famously said, horror can't exist without love. And I think that burrowed its way into my head very young, and it's really become more and more of a priority as I've been lucky enough to keep working, that I leave something for my kids to interrogate that doesn't show the world as being hopeless. And no matter how scary it is, and no matter how dark the things we want to explore and confront are, that there's always something underneath it that is tender and is gentle and encourages them not to ever give up, I think is where it comes from. But,
And you mentioned kind of discovering Stephen King, discovering horror quite young. Can you remember before that your first experience, like outside of literature, outside of film, of a feeling of pure terror, Mike? Is there a particular moment of raw fear that you can recall from childhood that, maybe set you on the path that you went on?
There are two, really. There's one that's kind of in media. That's something I saw that scared me so much. I didn't really understand how much it affected me until decades later. But it was an episode of Fraggle Rock, and I know it's so ridiculous. And it was the last place you'd expect to be terrified as a kid because it's adorable Muppets. And there was an episode they did where they had this thing called the Terrible Tunnel. And it was a place Fraggles weren't supposed to go. And they boarded it up and they said, stay out of this terrible tunnel because Fraggles go in and they never come out, which for me was like, wait, Fraggles die? That's new. And of course, one of these Fraggles goes into the tunnel, and the tunnel is full of the trapped, shredded ghosts of Fraggles. Like, it's terrifying, and they're trapped there. And I was utterly unprepared for this as a kid. It was this burst of horror, which it was a concept I didn't even understand outside of formless kind of childhood nightmares. And it infiltrated a space that was safe. Like, it was friggin' Fraggle Rock. It was like, this is where I go to sing songs and have fun. Like, what is this doing here? And it rattled me so much. And my parents remember me being unable to sleep and just being freaked out by this terrible tunnel. And it didn't occur to me until years after my career had really started. And I was doing an interview with someone about absentia. And it occurred to me that I just did the terrible tunnel. Like that decades later, that was my first kind of breakout, run at the horror genre. I went all the way back to that feeling of being a scared kid. And I think that's where we go. It's, we dig back into those barely remembered feelings of anxiety we have when we're very small. It really is the first emotion that we all collectively experience. Like, before we're forming memories, we're having nightmares. It's the strangest thing. But yeah, so that was the first time I remember being horribly scared, something I saw and watched. And I have I think it's a dream, because I'm a skeptical person, and I don't believe in ghosts the way they're kind of represented and in horror fiction. And I don't believe in a lot of things. I'm a very pragmatic human. And I have a memory, though, as a child, of a little boy looking into my bedroom window, very late at night. And I was on the second floor, and there was nothing underneath my window. And I tell myself, and I've told myself my whole life, that was a creepy dream I had as a child. But I remember that face vividly, and I can't think of another dream that I had that young that I recall, and that has stayed with me for my whole life. So that face in the window and that episode of Fraggle Rock have forged me into the genre aficionado that I am today.
But we've got to get you the Fraggle Rock IP, man. Let's get those rights.
I know. And then they did the reboot, and I was like, it's going to be great. I just hope they don't go full horror with it this time. Like, I hope they do a family-friendly version of Fraggle Rock for a change.
It's interesting. I think my first experience of terror that I cling on to, or have tried to discard over the years, but has kind of clung to me, very fittingly for this conversation about Midnight Mass, it was an oil painting of Jesus at the top of my grandparents' stairs, and his eyes seemed to kind of follow me around the hallway. And I obviously wouldn't have been able to articulate it then, but it strikes me now that the Bible and a lot of the tenets of Catholicism, they really terrified me as someone who grew up in an Irish Catholic family, because there's kind of a lot of elements within the lore of Christianity that are borderline horror, death, resurrection. That's kind of inherently supernatural, inherently spooky. Was that something that kind of preyed on your mind at all as you approached Midnight Mass?
Absolutely. So we both grew up Irish Catholic, right? So, and I completely agree with you. I would even argue it doesn't borderline horror. If you just take the Bible, it is full of horror stories.
Yeah,
I mean, straight up Fraggle Rock level. It is intense. And that was a hugely defining part of my childhood. I was an altar boy. I was in Sunday school. I went to Catholic elementary school, Catholic high school. I didn't really start to question it till I was in college. And so I was well into my 20s before I really looked back and thought, wait a minute, what does it mean to be a Catholic, and what is it that I'm meant to be believing? And started to interrogate it. And I always, from when I was a child all the way through, found Catholicism, found the Bible to be full of horror. And I remember getting in trouble at CCD when they were trying to explain, as we were preparing for First Communion, and they were trying to explain the concept of transubstantiation, which is that the bread and the wine are literally spiritually transformed into the actual flesh and blood of Jesus. And as a kid, I was terrified of that. I was like, well, what? What do you mean? I don't want anything to do with that. I don't want to drink blood, because the only thing I could associate that with was vampirism. And, and they're like, oh, no, you want to live forever, you have to drink the blood of Jesus. And I'm like, is anyone else seeing this the way I see it? This is vampiric. And when they, we got into the most basic stuff, I remember being corrected by Sister Cecilia, a nun in my first grade class, corrected me on the resurrection because I called Jesus a zombie. It very much, it was always, I was trying to reconcile everything I was learning about the faith with everything I thought I knew about horror, and mixing them up together. And that absolutely, Midnight Mass is a reaction to my whole life of that kind of bizarre cross thinking, and is in many ways kind of the inevitable reaction to my upbringing.
The balance of it is quite incredible. Like the duality of religion that it acknowledges, the way that faith can be a comforting presence, but it can also be weaponized with such violence. I'm aware the story began as a novel in 2010. Did it always, from the earliest iteration, aspire to have that balance? Was it always acknowledging of the fact that faith can be kind of a power for betterment as well as something that's divisive?
It's interesting. The earliest drafts of it were actually more critical of faith than where it landed. And it came out of years of religious study when I finally started to interrogate Catholicism and really look back on my upbringing. I spent about 6 years investigating world religions, and I came out of that an atheist. I came out of that, angry as well about a lot of the things that I had been taught growing up. And so even the novel, like the very earliest version of this thing, it started the same way, and it started with the image of the ichthys, the Jesus fish emblem on Riley's car with the siren lights. That has always been the first image of the thing. I initially, and I think in the novel there was blood on it from the accident, but I could never figure out how realistically to get the blood over to the back of the car like that. So we ended up getting rid of that, but it always was meant to kind of come roaring out as an intense indictment of some of what I believe to be the weaponization of any belief system, and specifically Catholicism for this story, but anything. It's softened over the years, actually, and as my emotional reaction to everything calmed and I got older, it became more important to have an equal counterweight and to say, I also want to show how beautiful faith can be expressed, and how the other side of that can, because I thought it was initially a story about faith versus reason, or belief versus disbelief.
Yeah.
And it wasn't ultimately. And to say, no, it's the way we believe and the way we demonstrate our faith and the way we behave. Those were the two sides I wanted to kind of pit against each other. It took me the longest time to realize that, how critical it was that I see a beautiful expression of faith from several of the main characters as a counterweight to the more weaponized and fanatical thinking of others. And I had to evolve myself to find that again and get over my, mid-20s kind of anger.
It might be, it just occurred to me that it might be surprising some listeners to hear us talking about Midnight Mass dating back so far, Mike. The show really spoke to our time when it eventually arrived in 2021. There's been a real uptick in Bev-like characters in global politics of late, kind of twisting religion into an instrument for power. There's also a lot that the show had to say, I guess, about kind of community hysteria and that slow crawl into deranged beliefs, which, wow, between January 6th and QAnon and kind of other flashpoints across the COVID era, we've seen a lot up close of that sort of thing lately. Were those always baked into this show, or did you see those trends emerging and kind of tinker with Midnight Mass as the years went on to lean into those elements? How did it work?
Coincidence more than anything else. The crazy thing to me is that it felt as relevant in 2010 as it does now. And that, if anything, I thought we were really pushing it. Bev Keane hasn't changed a note since she first hit the page. I thought we were kind of stretching a little with her, and the fact that we aren't, the fact that it's like she's not nearly as extreme as I thought she was. She's in Congress. That has proven to be kind of depressing for me. That that a lot of the ideas, I'm grateful because I think a lot of the ideas we talk about are relevant in any number of contexts historically. I'm watching this incredible documentary right now by Ken Burns called America and the Holocaust. Yeah. And I'm shocked by how similar the political landscape in America was then compared to now. And this, I read some critical pieces of Midnight Mass when it came out that said, oh, this is clearly an attack on Trumpism. Oh, this is clearly an attack. This is a reaction to COVID, which to me was completely insane. we were 2 weeks away from filming when the outbreak happened. We had no idea, but the fact that it can be so easily applied to these very immediate and contemporary events only, I think, reinforces our thesis that, belief systems can be weaponized very easily, and context can be very malleable. And so there was never a time when we said, oh, we should update this based on a current event. The idea was that the weaponization of a dogmatic belief system would always be relevant, and that if we waited another news cycle, there'd be another example that seemed to support our thesis. I think the thing I was writing about the most, I took out a couple of, there were some monologues in the early draft where characters discussed gay marriage very passionately. And that issue, by the time we got to shoot the show, wasn't nearly the hot topic, that it was in 2010. It felt like it was settled for the most part. And but there was a whole plot where Erin Green got in trouble with the school board on Crockett Island for her views about same-sex marriage, and I just needed to change the topic a little. The arguments all remained intact. It really, unfortunately, I think we're never going to run out of current events wherein this kind of faith is weaponized. And that is one of the reasons why the show is important to me.
So, you touched on that Erin storyline that came out. What else changed across all these different drafts as Midnight Mass went from a novel to a feature script in 2012 to a more advanced screenplay in 2013, and then eventually I think it was 2014 that you started to piece it together as a TV show. What were some of the big changes across that time?
Let's see. So the novel really, is very focused on Riley and opened the same way with the accident and then jail and then coming to Crockett and the arrival of Father Paul and the reunion with Aaron. All of that was there, and Bev was there. I think one interesting change about the novel, in that first draft, the sheriff was not a Muslim. that came later. The whole character of Sheriff Hassan came later. And I believe the sheriff's name was Gunning.
So you repurposed that?
Yeah, we took that and pushed that over to Sarah's character. But I made it not too far into the novel, and it felt too big, and it felt like I was just kind of spending most of my time speaking for Riley. I tried it as a script. I thought it'd be a great movie. I made it, I think, 180 pages in, and Riley and Father Paul were sitting down to have their first serious conversation in the AA meeting. And I was like, this isn't a movie. We have a long way to go. The bigger changes that kicked in happened when finally it became clear that we were going to, we developed it as a TV pitch. 2014 took it out. It was way more vampire centric because the pressure around town was get the vampires in there early. And so we had, a kind of accelerated vampiric presence that I never felt good about. The biggest change we had was from the very beginning up until about halfway through the Netflix writer's room. It was Aaron who got killed at midpoint and converted into a vampire, and comes to Riley's door, and they row out together, and she bursts into flames as the sun came up, and Riley rode back. And the whole thing was Riley was a skeptic. Aaron was a moderate. She got attacked by the vampires. She got converted to a vampire. She knew Riley would never believe it because he's a skeptic. So she sacrificially proved it to him. And then Riley went back to do battle with Father Paul. And it was Father Paul, the believer, versus Riley, the non-believer. And for the longest time, that's what the show was. And I remember two things happened in the writer's room that changed everything. One was it was Teresa Sutherland, one of our writers in the room, pitched that Erin was pregnant in the pilot, and that we would deal with it by having her body kind of just undo the pregnancy as she ingested more of the vampire blood. And the emotional impact of that, I thought, was so overwhelming that it started making me look at Erin very differently as a character. Because prior to that, the big question I kept wrestling with was, other than being a love interest for Riley, and then ultimately kind of sacrificing herself just to, again, benefit Riley on his journey, it was like, we aren't serving this character very well. And then with that pitch about her, it gave Erin a life that was fascinating to me outside of Riley. And it made me realize that I didn't want to do a show about Riley versus Father Paul and belief versus atheism, that kind of those two extreme positions should cancel each other out, and that the hero of the show was the moderate. And that would be the voice that we needed to serve the best. And so we switched the entire rowboat dynamic. And it was just, okay, so say Riley burns up. He's served his purpose in the story. And Erin, who is a character of faith, has to take this information and go back and inherits basically the show at that point. And it felt so correct. And I think part of what took me so long to realize it, I identified so strongly with Riley because Riley was this avatar for me, for my atheism, for my alcoholism, for my sobriety, which is a whole other gear that I should talk about that changed a lot. But I identified with him so strongly that it took years for me to realize that he needed to get out of the way. And that really broke things open in a huge way. I remember we had done even hints about a potential second season of the show where Riley fights with the angel at the end, and you see him get, his throat ripped open, and you never see him die on screen. And he came back as the antagonist of the second season as this traveling preacher with a like Southern Baptist revival tent. And it was Warren and Lisa chasing him across America, trying to kill Riley, because he was now the villain of the story. And it was like, we had all that stuff drawn out, and we threw it all away with Aaron. And once we decided this was actually Aaron Green's story and she was our hero, it made it okay for me to do something else I was reluctant to do, which was to kill the island. And initially I'd had about half the population was wiped out, and the others lived to pick up the pieces and learn their lessons. And with Aaron, I remember we had long discussions about whether Aaron survived the show. And when it was clear that she didn't, and that it all was going to end with Aaron musing about what happens when we die as she dies. At that point it was, if Aaron Green isn't here anymore, they can all go. And maybe that's where we find the poetry, and that's where we find the most beautiful expression of faith, I thought, would be when there's no apparent hope left and there's no witness to the heroism, that it's a closed system and the sun's coming up and it's done. And everyone's fate has been, meted out. All the cards have been turned over. That 10 minutes before the sunrise, I was like, that's where we can see faith. That's where we can see when it matters, when the stakes are gone and the outcome is preordained. That's when we can see it. So all of that, and them singing Nearer My God to Thee, and all my favorite things about the end never would have happened with Riley, where we would have made a show about the triumph of atheism, which is not the show I wanted to make. It's a show I thought I wanted to make when I was in my 20s, or the story I thought I wanted to tell when I was younger, but it wasn't. The other big change is I started writing this years before I got sober. And so I was writing about alcoholism and I was writing about sobriety long before I knew what I was talking about. So it cracks me up quite a bit, because the story's always started exactly the same way. It's always started with the car accident, with the DUI. The vehicular manslaughter, and that, more than I ever understood, was my biggest fear. And I started writing it before I ever acknowledged I had an issue with drinking, before I ever confronted it in any meaningful way. But that's what I was scared of, was that I was going to kill somebody if I didn't do something. And that subconscious fear, drove all these conversations. Like the Midnight Mass was always a series of conversations. And it was, I realize now, it was conversations I was having with myself and arguments I was having with myself. And I didn't get sober until 2018. I don't know what Midnight Mass would be if I hadn't gone through the years it took me to find that sobriety. And I think that's one of the other reasons why Riley as a character became less critically important to me at midpoint, is in a lot of ways I look back at Riley as who I was. And so, it changed a lot. It changed an awful lot over the years. And then you have kind of the superficial changes. I'll end this ramble on a laugh. Netflix made me put in the scene where the cat got killed in the pilot. This bizarre scene where a cat is stalked and killed on camera, like Jason Voorhees style, by an unseen thing. And I hate it so much. And to go for 10 years with this story that never had anything like that in it, and like have that kind of change land on you at the end, like for all the seismic huge changes that we did. That is one of the ones that sticks out the most when I see the final thing. It's not even in the script. It's just like this dumb thing that happens in the middle of the episode because they thought that'll get the viewers' attention. Look what they did to that cat. So, yeah.
Well, we spoke earlier about, earlier iterations having like a certain acceleration towards getting to the vampire material. It's a good 2 hours of television before you see someone get killed, and the best part of 3 before you really confront this creature. I guess if the bargain with Netflix is throw in this small scare involving a cat to kind of win the intrigue of an audience, then that's not the worst transaction to make. Speaking of transactions, the phrase you used there, like series of conversations around, well, alcoholism, but a lot of assets of the show. That's such a perfect word for it. In particular, in terms of sobriety, alcoholism, and that whole strand of this. One thing I find so interesting is the show has such an interesting articulation of one frustration that many people find with the 12-step program, like the transactionality of it. So it offers you salvation, but only through a signing of yourself over to the church, to a higher power. And it's obviously great that a lot of people, find some solace in that program. But for some, for Riley, as he kind of beautifully puts across, that the transaction taking place as you're offered help only in return for religious faith, that's kind of a roadblock, for some people in recovery. Can you talk to me about, there's so much nuance in the show, there's so much patience in the show. Can you tell me about like the fights you had to fight to win that? Was it a case of Hill House had been such a success that you had bought some trust, or how did it work out that way?
Oh, I ask myself that all the time. It's funny, and the scene that you're talking about specifically was one of the scenes we fought about with Netflix. Was this conversation about AA versus rational recovery, or RR, which is a program that I very much found value in, because I had the same roadblock to AA that you're describing. I know a fair amount of people that have, and that conversation was critically important to me as kind of not only for those characters, but articulating some of the really delicate, specific conversations we're having about rationalism and reason and faith and that transactional nature of some belief systems, whether they're, whether it's AA, whether it's a church, whether it's politics, whether it's, to some degree, competing opinions in the scientific community. There's a lot you can apply it to. Hill House was a hit, but I don't think it was a big enough hit to explain how we got away with some of the things we got away with on the show. There was enthusiasm from some of our executives at Netflix for what the show was. There was always pressure to take those conversations and make them much shorter, if not get rid of them entirely. And there was something else happening at Netflix at the time, which was there was a seismic regime change that kicked in. And there was a global pandemic right before production began. And there were executives who started with the show, but then did not finish with us because they were transferred internally. We had people who came onto the project well after it was shot. I think we walked kind of between the raindrops on a lot of aspects of the show that otherwise would have invited much more scrutiny and potentially interference. And there's a part of me that feels like we slid in between these two huge pillars of the story of Netflix. And as a result, we were able to get away with a lot more than otherwise we would have. And I vividly remember when we were in editorial on the show and there was a whole new executive team on it, when they came to look at it and said, where are all the vampires? and it was like, you'll see, just wait. And that by then there was a sense of like, well, this one's kind of cooked. They got there too late to really change it too much, because it was like, well, we'll focus instead on the Midnight Club, and a lot of that energy for change went into there. But yeah, we kind of got away with a ton. I know for a fact, because it's been said to me, they wouldn't make this show this way now. And
really?
Yes. So I know and I've talked to other showrunners too who became fans of the show, and who would say, like, I can't get away with a 9-minute conversation about what happens when we die. How did you get away with that? You don't even cut away. And it's like, yeah, I don't know. It's a mix of, we did have some phenomenally supportive creative partners at Netflix and in Netflix who championed the show all the way. And I think we got lucky that we slid in there between some huge events in the world where people were pretty distracted. So, yeah.
I suppose, from a studio perspective, the long wait to see the vampire, it helps when the vampire is as interesting and arresting as it is in Midnight Mass. Did the creature, did it go through many different iterations? Like, the fine line that it walks visually between angel and monster in the finished series is so superb, and it's so reflective of that duality that we were speaking to earlier, the way in which faith can be something angelic, something positive, but also a weapon for catastrophe. How did you approach the creature itself, and what kind of evolutions did it go through as you rewrote and rewrote?
It was always, the biblical description of angels I find fascinating and horrifying, and down to ones that have absolutely no human characteristics whatsoever. And there's some beautiful images online you can find where people have tried to faithfully render an angel based on a specific passage of the Bible and how it's described. And sometimes it's a wheel of eyeballs, and sometimes it's just this crazy kind of geometric monsters. I really wanted us to walk that line, because for me, the vampire of the story, the angel of the story, represents fanaticism, which has to be at once grotesque and terrifying and inviting and familiar, if that's where your belief system has primed you to see it that way. And so that was the initial thing, was take the Bible, look at the angels, look at our popular cultural depictions of angels, which have changed over the years, and then go back into some of our most basic and fun expressions of vampirism, and see where they overlap, see where the Venn diagrams kind of naturally intersect. And let's focus on those elements. Let's play with the wings. How can we make wings that are familiar, angelic, mostly because of the kind of horns at the top of the wings that make them feel angelic, but you take away the feathered aspect and give it more of a bat vibe that tilts you more toward Bram Stoker. We played back and forth. But the angel itself, by the time we actually were looking at designs, I think we did 2 or 3 iterations with minor adjustments. But I think I had told them, if you can go back to Paradise Lost and look at Renaissance art of angels and demons, and then remember Klaus Kinski and Werner Herzog's Nosferatu and try to get them all together somehow, that would be my perfect creature. And I think they did. And the litmus test was always, how does it look in a cassock? How does it look in a chasuble? And we'd have one rendering of the creature just as it was, and one of it in the ceremonial, silver chasuble. And it was just those 2 images. Once they felt good together, we were good.
You mentioned that, originally this story was very much told through the eyes of Riley, and it was much less an ensemble piece. Nowadays, I think, you're known as someone who gravitates towards ensemble fiction. From Hill House to Midnight Club, there's many characters. And I guess, I'm fascinated by the ways in which you construct these ensembles as to have lots of characters, a variety of personalities, and each of them have hopes, fears, desires, and darknesses that you can kind of collide with one another. Is there a particular process that you have, Mike? And maybe you can use Midnight Mass as an example. Do you ask yourself, once you have a theme you want to interrogate, okay, what characters could I create here that would create different ways into that topic, and then is that what leads you logically into, okay, how about a sheriff with experiences of Islamophobia whose faith has been tested by the death of his wife? Is that the kind of way in for you?
Absolutely. And you know, when the show became much more about different expressions of faith and the weaponization of that, and how faith can be demonized as well, that opened it up. This had always been a story about Christianity for me, because that's where the majority of my life experience was rooted. But I thought that was a wonderful opportunity. And it's like, okay, let's try to find a way to truly explore Islam through a character, and the different ways that faith is perceived, especially in our country. I love ensemble. I really do. And I find that I am prone to lazier or more kind of masturbatory writing if the fewer characters I have, because there's less people there to question them. There's less to challenge their goals in a scene, their beliefs in this particular project's case. It's easier to fall into a rut and just start talking through characters instead of trying to see through their perspectives. And, you know, that question of like, am I trying to teach the viewer something, or am I trying to learn something through the process of writing this? And I find that if I'm trying to learn, it goes way better. The story's better, for everyone's happier. If I'm trying to teach, I very quickly realize how little I know. And so this became this beautiful opportunity for me to take a perspective that was very much Riley, and that was already well represented in the story, and to challenge it. You know, I described it early as, I'm going to play both sides of the chessboard, but that wasn't it. I had to try to really understand who each piece was and why they moved the way they moved, what they wanted. And I love that work. I love putting a character up who isn't familiar, who isn't just, you know, an avatar, and try to get to know them, and fall in love with them a little bit. Or in the case of Midnight Mass, a lot. You know, I think I loved every character in the show except for Bev.
Yeah.
I tried so hard. There's a scene where we desperately tried to humanize Bev, and I throw in the towel. Like the next scene, it's like, I just can't with her. But we tried, you know, we really tried, and I tried to make it, yeah. But that's also come with getting older, is a desire not to use these stories or these characters as a delivery system from my point of view. To use them as a way for me to grow. And that has changed a lot of my approach to things. But putting up the characters on the board and dreaming up who they were, what their goals are, what their secrets are, what their weaknesses are, what their strengths are, and finding how they all fit together or conflict with each other. If you put the work into the character, the mechanics of the script start to become so much easier, because the characters begin to dictate what you can and can't do. And if you really stick to it, you find yourself in periods of intense frustration saying things like, but Aaron wouldn't do that. Or, you know, Father Paul would not allow that to happen. And it starts to feel out of your hands. If you've done the work on the characters, you start to feel boxed in by what they will and will not abide as fictional characters. And it starts to demand the story, you know, your options whittle down. And I think for Midnight Mass, for the longest time, it felt like there were all these different roads that the story could go down. And it was a question of creating enough of a structure around it that it whittled itself smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until the outcome of the story felt like the only one that could realistically occur. And I've never had that happen with a project before. We've always had a goal in mind, an outcome in mind. And like I said, for this one, it was like, we need to end up in a place where Riley's running a revival tent in the deep South, and Warren's a vampire hunter. And it's like we had all these grand ideas for what to do. And I loved the way it was stripped down to this inevitable ending that just felt like there's no way for me to get out of it as a writer. There's no way for them to get out of it as characters. So what are we all going to do for those last 5 pages together? Like what do we do? And to be able to watch characters sum up who they are in one moment of action at the end, was really, I've never had an experience like it writing. And then it's like, because of course Bev Keane buries herself in the sand, there's no other way it can go. So it makes it, in one way, it makes your job as a writer much easier, because it's just like, there's nothing else I can do.
Hey, this is Al, just jumping in to tell you about 2 of our great sponsors this week. If you've written a script and are wondering what step to take next, well, you need to check out We Screenplay. We Screenplay not only offers amazing free resources for emerging writers, like virtual events where your questions are answered by leading Hollywood professionals, it's also the industry's #1 script coverage service. With incredible 72-hour turnaround and format-specific feedback tailored to your specific goals, We Screenplay is used by thousands of writers in every phase of their career, from first-time writers to Oscar winners. So if your script is ready to go, check out one of We Screenplay's labs, where dozens of writers have been repped, optioned and staffed as a direct result of their real-life industry meetings and hands-on workshops. Don't stay stuck, We Screenplay wants to help. Head to wescreenplay.com to find out more, or click the link in today's show notes. Support for this episode also comes from Arc Studio Pro. Screenwriting to me is all about immersion. I want to stay immersed in that dreamy, fantasy-like state while I weave my story and craft my characters. I don't want to be distracted by anything, and I certainly don't want to be thinking about text formatting. Arc Studio Pro understands that. It's so intuitive, it has a minimal and, dare I say, beautiful interface that allows me to stay completely focused on the story I'm trying to tell. To take your screenwriting to the next level, visit arcstudiopro.com/scriptapart, where you can either download a free version or get $30 off a pro account to unlock its full host of amazing features. Use the code FRIENDS at checkout to get that discount. That's arcstudiopro.com/scriptapart. Okay, let's get back to the conversation. Well, you referred there to the one possible way this could all play out, and we should talk about that and what it meant for the ending of the show, what it meant for the ending of some of these characters. I'd especially love to talk about Erin and her arc, and the way that her story ends, because wow, this hit me pretty hard. I think Midnight Mass, for all its condemnation of some facets of religion, it does seem to subscribe to the idea of some kind of divinity, I think. Like, things happen for a reason in this show. In episode 4, Erin talks about her mother clipping doves' wings so that they couldn't fly to the mainland. And in her final moment, with this kind of incredible moment of sacrifice on her part, she's able to pull from that story and clip the wings of the angel, of the vampire. Can you talk me through how that came to be, and whether writing scenes for any character to be played by Kate can be challenging at all, Mike? Like, I don't know, maybe you're anesthetized to it after so many collaborations together, but I think I'd find it initially quite hard writing for a loved one to put that character through such hardship. It
was interesting because, when Kate for years, Kate lived with the project believing she died in the rowboat. And was building, psyching herself up for that moment, and was very excited about it. With Erin, we talked so much about, what note, whether it was, defiance, anger, forgiveness, all these different ideas that you start pinning to different characters. And for Erin, she was love and acceptance. And when it comes to love, we explore different types of it in the show, and that all goes back to the more academic kind of side of the way I was raised, the different kinds of love. But the one that in Christianity and is specifically called out biblically as being the ultimate expression of love is to give your life for another. And I've always felt like the ultimate expression of that is to give your life for people you'll never no. And Erin articulates as much. So it's like she ended up representing, I think, one of the most powerful facets of faith, which is that, especially in a messianic kind of faith system, when people take on that particular characteristic of their savior and give their life for someone else or for others, whether it's literally or through service or that to me is one of the most beautiful expressions of faith. So that's where we wanted Erin to go. And then, she's like, just don't let me die ugly and sad, like even I know my throat's ripped out. I know it's not a peaceful death. But just let her be okay. Let her show us acceptance. That was important to Kate because she was terrified of playing it, of having to play it. But for me, I was like, this is the chance, because earlier in the show, Riley articulated my opinion of what happens when we die when I was at my most kind of atheistic, right? And right after that, Erin articulated the most kind of idealistic version of what I used to believe happened when we died when I was younger and in the church. And neither of them felt right, because I do think, I agree, there is a spirituality to this show, and there's a symmetry to the morality of the show. And that's like that Erin's childhood informs this final moment. And, that Hassan and Ali spend their final moments in prayer, which is where we first met them in some semblance of parental and harmony. And then they fell out of that. And that's how they kind of come back. That, symmetry, I believe very much in symmetry. But I was like, this is the chance where I can really try to type out what I think today about what happens when we die, and kind of what I hope it is, as a secular humanist who loves Carl Sagan and who believes very much that, spiritualism and science are not at odds. The more I've learned about both of them, this is a chance for me to try to put those words out. And in that case, there's no person I'd rather be entrusting those words to than Kate. And when we talk about what we leave for our kids, Kate and I have 2 kids together, and the idea that she was like, yeah, this is someday they can watch it and say, this is what Dad believed, and this is Mom saying it and performing it. That was a really kind of awesome opportunity for us. But I think I worked on that page of Erin's monologue more than any other section of the whole show, over several different years. And it used to be Riley's. It used to be his thing. But yeah, I'm very glad Kate was the one who got to say it. I think she brought something to it that I couldn't, and that Riley certainly couldn't.
And what was the emotional aftermath like for you, Mike, having worked on Midnight Mass for so long and having put so much of yourself onto the page? Like, that now that dust, God, that's almost a really bad pun considering how the show ends. But now the dust has very figuratively and literally settled. Like, how do you reflect back on this story and sort of some of the reactions that presumably fans have been coming up to you to share with you since the show aired?
I think it's always going to be my favorite. I get very emotional watching the show. I stayed away from it for the longest time. I didn't watch it when it came out. And I finally kind of a year later went back, and enough had gone on, and I was off to like the 3rd project since then. And I just sat and took it in, because we never get to watch these things. We see them so many hundreds of times in post and mix and color grading, and like, you never watch it. I'll never get to watch it, but the closest I come is after the fact, when I can look back with some distance. I find it to be a strange experience, because I'm very proud of and embarrassed by a lot of it. I feel exposed, but I feel grateful that I got to put it out there. I feel that the show is something much richer than it ever existed in my head. The other writers, the other actors who poured themselves into it took this period of kind of existential strife in my life and have helped turn it into something I think is really rather beautiful. It's some of my favorite time I've ever spent working. So I also remember the day-to-day of being on set with those people. Like, it's my favorite cast I've ever worked with. It's my favorite crew I've ever worked with. And that world we built together dissipated as they do. And I've worked with a lot of the same people again, but we all agree, as great as it is, when we get together, there was something about that one that we all took with us that, you know, we won't be able to recreate. I felt depressed and exhausted when it was finished. I felt way less precious about a lot of my other work. And when I would get pushback from executives or, you know, especially the pressure to make something more commercial, I'd say, sure, you know, I made my stand. I got to do that show the way it was. And so a lot of the work I've done since, I love it. It's important to me, but it isn't as personal. So I'm less sensitive to how it's perceived and to how it's treated. I started doing conventions last year with my wife. She had done a bunch with Annabeth Gish and Henry Thomas, and it's a whole other world out there for this direct fan interaction. I never really did it. But Kate encouraged me to go once or twice. She's like, you'll be surprised. You're really going to enjoy this. And you might, if you meet the people who have a very personal reaction to some of this work, it might mean a lot to you. And I felt kind of embarrassed and uncomfortable about it, but I went, and people come up. I've talked to a lot of people in various stages of recovery from addiction, to whom the show means a lot. And that really moves me. I've talked to a lot of fans who, it's fascinating to me, fans who are religious who love the show, fans who are not religious and love the show. The most critical, like vicious review I ever read of the show was written by an atheist, and I still can't understand it.
I think I've read the one.
Yeah, I thought for sure while I was doing it, I was like, I'm going to enrage people in the church, and the atheists are going to like the show, but I'm going to lose everybody else. And to see I talked to a priest who loves the show while this atheist is furious. And I'm like, I don't understand how any of this happened either. It's the show means different things to different people. And I find it to be fascinating and incredibly rewarding. And I find myself I get very emotional when I interact with fans. I feel very grateful. And when I had this with Hill House too, there's something about, and Bly Manor too, there's something about the fans of those shows who can really articulate this profound kind of meaning that they received from it. And that to me is one of the bigger honors of my life. So yeah, with this one, I've kept a bunch of little souvenirs. I have props and I have wardrobe from it, and I've got the angel's wings in my garage. and I have all these little disparate pieces of it because I don't want to let any piece of the show go. And every time I do it, I feel like I've drifted further and further away from this really kind of amazing place. But in some moments when I'm working on new projects, I get very insecure, and I say to Kate, I'm like, I don't think I'm ever going to be able to do that again. I don't think I have it in me to do something like that again. And she's like, you don't have to right now. Give it another 10 years. And you're not going to run out of things to say. It's like, I'm curious to see what you think of those monologues and what you think of the point of view and the way that I look back at myself on the novel. And I'm like, I didn't get it yet. 20 years from now, I wonder what I'll think when I watch it. Because I imagine I'll have some addendums that I wish I could put on, and I'll still want to cut that goddamn cat shot out of the show.
Well, it must be such a strange feeling, staring down a blank slate again after aspiring to write a story this personal for so long, and then kind of finally accomplishing that ambition. The Midnight Club, that was your follow-up series that came out in October, and it definitely had the feel of a palate cleanser. It seemed like you were having a lot of fun with it. I know that those stories that have had a deep personal attachment to you for a long time, but yeah, it did feel loose and it did feel free in a way that was kind of, I guess, like interpretable as, okay, Mike's exercised something there. There's with Midnight Mass, he was able to cleanse himself of something, and now he's moving forward. And that project felt like a reset button almost. Yeah, looking ahead, I'd love to hear about some of the other projects post Midnight Club, post Midnight Mass, and hear how they may have been affected by what you achieved with Midnight Mass. I know you've been working really hard on House of Usher, for example. So maybe we can start there. Is it right to assume we'll see that project this Halloween, Mike?
I don't have an official date on it, but I think that's a safe assumption. Usher's very different from anything else that I've ever done. It's insanely fun. Midnight Mass is very serious and very, very heavy work. And I've had since then a real desire not to carry that much weight into a project and through a project. And so Usher has some really fascinating and fun things to say about the world, but it's just fun. Like there are times I look at the show and I'm like, I think we made a comedy. Like it's riotously fun. And Midnight Club was a palate cleanser, and it was very kind of innocent. I think that show, if I'm very vulnerable and honest about it, I think that show bore the brunt of a lot of the creative compromise that Midnight Mass otherwise would have. And it's almost like Midnight Mass got away with so much and the Midnight Club didn't. There's a lot more compromise in there ultimately with the show we made versus the show I wanted us to make. And I'm very proud of Midnight Club. I love it, but it didn't work the same way. And there's a part of me that's always feeling a little bit like the Midnight Club was kind of punished for the sins of Midnight Mass, but it's I remember the moment they came in and they were like, no monologues, and it's like, okay, yes, okay. So yeah, it has been really nice to start, and particularly in my feature work of late, in my I'm desperate to get back into features as much as I love television. It's been like 5 years since I've really gotten to play in that world. And my priority shifting from I want to get this very personal point of view out there and interrogated to I want to make something entertaining. I've felt that change of like I want to put the weight down for a minute and just try to really entertain people. That has definitely been a big part of it. So yeah.
So is House of Usher a response then to Midnight Mass in any way? Or you mentioned it's different to anything you've done before.
Yes. And it was from conception. It was like, this is going to be crazy. Like, this is going to be over the top. I use musical metaphors a lot. And I was like, if Hill House is a string quartet or a piece of classical music and Midnight Mass is a hymn, then The Fall of the House of Usher is heavy metal and so much fun. And it's the last of our Netflix shows. So it's also kind of the curtain call for this whole little universe we've been able to build. It's a lot of the same actors. from all the shows, like from all the hauntings and the midnights, are all kind of together in one show now. And it's a show where it takes some substantial risks, but they're all very fun. So you kind of get away with a lot more. It also kind of came at a time when, there was yet another systemic change at Netflix, and we were moving over to Amazon. We knew our time at Netflix was over. And so there was a lot less pressure on that as well. It's like, this is the last one. I want to do it the way we want to do it. And Netflix seemed very happy with that. So, yeah, it's all very different, but it's interesting because Kate will tell you Usher is her favorite show. Of
really?
Yeah. And I'll say, but Midnight Mass is my favorite. She says, yeah. And I get that. Usher's mine. So it's I think at the end of the day, it'll be something that people haven't seen before that I think will be really fun.
And then is it onto the Dark Tower? Like, how does that fit into your crazy itinerary?
If Ka wills it, yeah. We have the Dark Tower. We carved it out from our Netflix deal, knowing we were leaving. And we carved it out from our Amazon deal as well, knowing that they'd already tried to do it and might be reluctant to do it. So the Dark Tower doesn't have a studio. Like, we don't have a partner on it yet. So I'm developing it myself, which is really a blast. And that's my dream project. I've wanted to do that for so long. If we can get it off the ground, if we can actually get it going, I'm not ruling out Amazon's involvement down the line. Where, our relationship with them is brand new. So we'll have to see. But I work on the Dark Tower in one capacity or another every day. And God, I hope that's next. But the industry is so crazy right now. And
yeah.
There's no stable ground anywhere, really. And every time you kind of think it's streaming is where it's at, or movies are coming back, or movies are in trouble, no one goes to the theaters. No one really knows what's happening. And so I've learned over the years to try to keep as many plates spinning as I can, because you never know which one is going to take off. All I wanted in the world back in 2014 was for someone to make Midnight Mass right then. And we took it to every TV studio in town. And I'm so glad they didn't. I wouldn't have done it right. And I have that in the back of my mind with all of the projects, including the Dark Tower now. I want to do it right now. So bad. But I don't know that that's right now. And that 2 years from now might not be the time when we got to do it properly. And so I've become much more flexible and much more kind of open to letting the industry tell me what's next, and kind of letting life tell me what's next, and just being ready, and if I find myself with an hour to kill, I'm going to be working on my Dark Tower script. So
you mentioned 2014, all you wanted was to make Midnight Mass.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that you wanted to do in 2014 that I came across in my research for this conversation, Mike, you had talked about having recently watched someone play The Last of Us, and now you were inspired to make a video game. That was something you really wanted to do at some point.
Yeah.
Recently, I saw a photo of you hanging out with Hideo Kojima, the video game legend. So, is that still an ambition for you?
Absolutely, that's an ambition for me. And when I talk about leaving room for the world to tell me what to do, that's a huge ambition for me. I also think it might be the future of storytelling. Between The Last of Us and then Death Stranding, which knocked me over. I have a 12-year-old son, and part of the big joy of my life is to introduce him to movies that I love. And he likes them just fine. He's like, cool. But man, when he plays a video game, he is immersed in that story in such a powerful way. And he keeps saying, I wish you did this. I wish you did this. I'm like, I think you're right. And I think more and more younger viewers are going to want to participate in the stories that they consume. And as the technology becomes so immersive and so incredible, I really think, we're on the precipice of a major leap forward in the evolution of storytelling. And I think, Kojima-san is at the cutting edge of that. I admire him so much, and I've gotten to meet him a few times now. And yes, I would love to be involved in creating an immersive story for someone to enjoy that way. And Hideo's talking about changing the way we experience the world in the work that he does. So I'm lucky to know him. And interestingly, the reason I know him at all on a personal level is, boy, he really liked Midnight Mass. And
that's right. He tweeted about it. I remember that.
That's how he tweeted about it. Rahul Kohli went ballistic. And and we DM'd each other on Twitter, and that's the whole thing. Like it's such a bizarre world like that right now. And it's funny, The Last of Us bowled me over all those years ago, and now I'm hanging on every episode of it, and so impressed by what Craig has done with that show, that I DM'd him on Twitter to tell him how much I love it. And so now we're talking. Like it's all ridiculous. But yes, I would love to do, long answer to a very easy question. I would love to do video game, and I'm trying to find the right way to do that.
And speaking of The Last of Us, Mike, which is kind of ostensibly a zombie story, there are a lot of other subgenres within the horror category that so far you've yet to explore. You've of course made ghost stories. You've of course made vampire tales. I'm just curious, like, what other horror traditions, be it kind of aliens or serial killers or zombies or anything like that, what else you'd love to tackle?
All of it. The one of the first scripts I ever took out in Hollywood was a zombie script. It's called 7 Dead Men. It was really, really fun. And they told us at the time that particular subgenre was dead, and that no one was interested in zombie stuff anymore. And I think a year and a half after that, The Walking Dead hit. I think shortly after that, The Last of Us. I had a script that was all about cordyceps fungus.
No way. Did you tell Craig that?
I did. I was like, before I ever saw the game, I saw the video of the ant.
That's crazy.
And was so horrified. I was like, what a great way into a zombie story. And then
how much overlap was there?
I mean, we had the virulent. I think the script that I wrote there was called The Strain. I mean, Jesus, boy, that title got hijacked. And it was people on a destination wedding who went to a wrong private island, found the aftermath of these strange fungal stalks, and realized when they looked down that the bases of them were people. And then one at a time realized they'd been infected by the spores and that it was eating away their brain. And so they got violent and could pass it by biting. But by the end, the stalks grew out of their eyes, and it was this whole thing. And I think we had justified it as the fungus had been affected because of pharmaceutical experimentation, trying to develop a more potent and cheaper, more powerful antibiotic. And it was a fun script. And Jeff Howard and I worked on it for a while. And then I saw The Last of Us, the game, and I was like, oh, well, we can throw this away. Which happens so often in this business, where you're just kind of like, I didn't know that was coming. And we wasted a year on a concept that, barely scratched the surface of the amazing work they were doing. But Yeah, that happens all the time. The first script that I ever took out for sale was a werewolf script. I'd still love to get that going. I still have it. So I don't want to spoil that one. I know the cordyceps one won't go anywhere, so I'm happy to share that one. But yeah, I'd love to hit all of it. And one of the things that really energized me was I saw what Dan Trachtenberg did with Prey last year.
Oh man, so good.
So good. And it never would have occurred to me that it's like, oh, right. I grew up with these franchises I love, Alien, Predator. What if I could riff on that? What if I could come up with a new story in that universe to tell? And I think he demonstrated so incredibly how you could do that in a way that honors a franchise while making it feel completely brand new. And I was so amazed by the ingenuity of it, that's changed the way I think about it. And because I guess for the longest time I would look at it and be like, oh, I don't want to do a Predator sequel. I don't want to go in and pitch on Alien 7. Like it feels wrong. But when you're like, no, I could do my own thing using these elements that I love. I think that's incredibly exciting. And I think it's what's going to make all of these franchises viable in the long term.
Yeah. That actually leads me quite nicely onto, some questions we've had from our Patreon supporters. Ted Wilkes, he was curious whether there is a monster from the horror canon or some sort of IP, the way that kind of you mentioned Prey there. Is there one of those in particular that you'd love to pick up, or that you think deserves a reboot, a prequel, or a requel, to use a modern phrase? Is there one in particular that jumps out that you have a special connection to?
Oh, sure. Back when Universal was trying to build the dark universe out, I was like, God, I just want to do Creature from the Black Lagoon. I just want to find a way into that. But beyond that, I've threatened over the years to be like, could we come up with a world-beating Tremors movie? Could we come up? I love Carpenter's They Live. That's a film I think is as relevant today as ever. That could absolutely stand a wonderful kind of reboot. But yeah, I think those would be the big ones. For the longest time, I would say Dracula, but I think I got to do my Dracula. One of the ones on my list forever has been A Nightmare on Elm Street. Boy, that would be fun. I have a whole take for it that I worked out a couple of years ago, and my understanding is the rights situation for that title is so fraught. No one knows who controls it really, and no one knows who to pitch. So I keep saying to my agents, like, send me in A Nightmare on Elm Street, and they're like, we'd love to. We have no idea who you should talk to. And I've talked to, I spent almost a year of my life with Heather Langenkamp, and we would talk about it. And it's like, nobody knows what to do. But one of these days, perhaps. Oh, hold on. We have a visitor. My son, Cody, is popping his head in the door. Hi.
Hey, Cody, special guest.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm in a meeting, and then I'll be out with you in just a little bit. Okay. Thank you so much. All right. Cody and I are making a movie today. So
no way. Okay, I'm getting the exclusive on that. So what's the plan there?
He's curious about what I do, and he asked if he could make a movie, if he could write and direct a movie. And so I've a little bit of work, some meetings this afternoon, and after that, my promise to him was I would be his DP. He's going to write and direct his first film, and I'm going to shoot it for him. It'll be whatever he wants. So we're going to go make a movie tonight, and I'm very excited about it.
Well, I don't want to keep you too long before you go and make this masterpiece. But I do have one last question from a Patreon supporter. Yeah. Sarah Jensen wrote in to say, Al, your questions are often longer than the monologues in Mike's work. So please ask this question. How do you write your beautiful monologues, Mike? What's the effect that they have on an audience, do you think? And how do you work out where they'll best suit the flow of an episode?
That is a huge question.
Yeah.
I don't know. I never, with some rare exceptions, I think with, What Happens When We Die in Midnight Mass, I intended those to be monologues. I knew going in, we were going to just sit and talk about it. A lot of the other ones happen because I start to talk about something in the scene and it kind of takes over. I find myself breaking it up on the page. They'll talk for 4 or 5 lines and I'll put in a completely erroneous action line, like, she sighs or something, and then keep going. And the more I find myself doing that, the more I realize I'm self-consciously trying to avoid the appearance of a monologue on the page by breaking up that chunk of text. I think they have a mixed impact on people. I've talked to people who love them. I've read criticisms of people who hate them and claim to be bored to tears. I loved theater growing up, and one of the most impactful movies I ever saw was Paris, Texas, Wim Wenders' film, which has a world-ending monologue by a character who spends the whole first half of the movie not saying anything, and then sits down, and Sam Shepard wrote it, and it's one of the most incredible pieces of writing, perfectly performed, and shot. And it knocked me so over that I remember feeling I wish I could do that. And that was when I knew what a monologue was. That was when I was sophisticated enough to say that is a particular type of art that I want to explore. As a kid, I was in love with Quint's monologue in Jaws. I didn't even know what the word for it was. I just thought that part in the boat when he told that story was amazing. Yeah. And so I've always been drawn to it. I love language. I love finding music in it. I love when words fit together in a way that make me respond to the craftsmanship of the words. It happens sometimes. I'll watch something and go, wow, just those words in that order created music. It created a rhythm that could only have been done that way. And theater does it beautifully all the time. It's a dying art in film and television, I think, because audiences are intentionally conditioned to demand new input in much shorter intervals. And it's I'm going to sound very like get off my lawn, but it's the short attention span that's being forced on the way we train people to watch movies and television. I love pushing back against that. I love settling in. I love watching a good actor deliver something that transports me out of where I'm at, makes me ignore what's in the frame, and ignites a second movie in my imagination. And when I see other people do it, it's a magic trick. I've always wanted to harness it. I throw darts at it all the time. There are times like when I saw Robert Longstreet drop that monologue in The Haunting of Hill House, I was transfixed on set and I knew it would work. There are others I hope will work, and I never know if they do. And my very favorite ones, I've seen people tattoo parts of them on their bodies. I've also had them be called out in reviews as the thing that ruined the show. So it really, I don't know. The process of writing them is meditative. I can tell you, just about without exception, every monologue you see in anything I've done was twice as long when I started. Part of the challenge for me is to cut them in half. I try to say everything I want to say, and then I come back and say, and how do I say this in as few words as possible? And then sometimes I say, screw the second part. I like the language. But it's something I'll never give up on. I really love when it works. And it's something that my actors love. They love to be able to do that in a medium that is looking for edits, that is cutting away from actors mid-sentence throughout most of their work. To just say, let's all agree and sit around the campfire with someone and look at their face and listen to them talk. I love it. I think it makes us better listeners. And as I'm sure noticed on this podcast, I'm prone to monologue. I can't help it.
You and me both. It's all good.
Yeah. I mean, Why not? We only have so many words we're going to say in our life. Like, let's get as many out as we can when we can. So.
Well, I hope Cody sneaks in a few monologues into his film this afternoon. Mike, this has been so much fun, man. Halloween 2024, 2025, whenever it is that you finally nail The Haunting of Fraggle Rock, we need you back on the show, man.
Yes, absolutely. Look, I've enjoyed this conversation enormously. And count me in anytime. I'd be thrilled to come back and talk about any of the other stuff that you want to talk about anytime.
That'd be so great. Well, thanks so much, Mike. Really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, produced by Camille Demek. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.